Dobry wieczór, nazywam się Miriam Klimova, jestem
Okay,
rabinką
let's
w
start.
Haifa,
My
w
name is
północnym
Rabbi Miriam
Izraelu.
Klimova. I am a rabbi
Serdecznie
in
witamy
Haifa in
Cię
the
i każdego
north
z
of
Was
Israel.
na naszym
And
cyklu
I'd like
wykładów
to welcome all of
poświęconych
you.
żydowskiej tradycji oraz
These are
historii
our
narodu
lectures
żydowskiego.
about Jewish tradition,
Wszyscy
about the history
śledzimy
of the
obecne
Jewish
wydarzenia na
nation.
świecie.
Right now, we are all following
Dlatego z
the
góry
events
przepraszam,
in the world.
jeśli
I
będziemy
hope
musiały
so.
przerwać
So
nasze
I'd like
spotkanie.
to apologize in advance if
Ale
I'm
na razie
forced
kontynuujemy
to
lekturę rozdziału
suspend our
książki
meeting,
rabina Marca
but as for now, we
Rosensteina,
continue reading the
który
book
nazwał
of
swoją
Marc
książkę
Rosenstein,
Turning
and
Points
he
in Jewish
entitled his
History,
book
punkty
Turning
zwrotne w
Points in
historii
Jewish
żydowskiej.
History.
Podczas naszych poprzednich wykładów, spotkań omówiliśmy już emancypację, omówiliśmy wpływ
Previously,
tej
we
emancypacji
talked
na
about
myśl żydowską, a
emancipation,
także
about
na
how it
pierwsze
influenced
zmiany,
Jewish thinking.
na te zmiany, które przynosi i na te zmiany, które ukazuje
We
bezpowrotnie na
also
życie
talked about
żydowskie.
the changes that it
Kiedy
brought
wracamy,
about
to widzimy, że
when it
dwa
comes
różne
to Jewish life.
stulecia, 1815
So we see that we had two
i
Ardest centuries
1840,
from
48,
the
wszystkie te
1700s
wydarzenia
to the
mówią nam o tym,
1900s.
że zajęło
We had
chrześcijan
many
około
events,
200 lat
and this tells
teologicznej
us that it
podróży po
took
to, aby
Christians in
sformułować
Western
nowe
Europe about
rozumienie państwa
200 years to
i
formulate a new
nowe rozumienie
understanding of the
miejsca,
state
jakie
and
zajmuje
a new
w tym
understanding of
państwie
the place
jednostka.
that the individual
Czyli
occupies within
raptem
it.
mówimy o powstaniu nowoczesnego państwa, które składa
So
się z
we are
obywateli,
talking about
którzy mają
the
indywidualne
establishment of a
prawa,
modern state made up of
bezpośrednią
citizens who have
relacją
their
z
own
państwem,
individual rights.
bez religii.
They have a
Aby
direct
przeniesienie
relation
religii od
with their
strefy
state without
indywidualnej wolności
the intermediary
uwalnia nam Żydów
religion.
od zbiorowego ucisku. Wreszcie nie ma ani żadnych ulic żydowskich. Możemy
So
mieszkać tam, gdzie
this
chcemy.
change
Nie
freed
ma
the Jews from
ograniczeń
collective
do
oppression.
zawodów. Nie ma odznak,
There are
które
no longer
musimy
special
nakładać
Jewish
na siebie.
taxes, Jewish badges, restrictions on access to
Kiedy
professions or streets designated
mówiliśmy
specifically for
o
Jewish
tym,
residents.
jak to wszystko odzwierciedla się na życiu żydowskim, to widzimy
So we
w Europie
discussed
Zachodniej
how
kilka
this
nakładających się
influenced
na siebie
Jewish life,
skutków.
and in Western
Jeden z
Europe,
nich
we
to jest
see
koniec
several
autonomicznych
overlapping
społeczności.
consequences. One of them is the
E,
end of the
Jest ono
autonomous
dobro,
community.
ale też jest wyzwaniem. Nie
Such a
mamy już
community is
państwa w
something good,
państwie.
but
Ale
at the
jeśli
same
jesteśmy
time,
na tyle otwarci
this
do
change is a
społeczeństwa
challenge. So, on the one
zewnętrznego,
hand, we no longer have
w
a
jaki
state within a
sposób
state,
wywiera to na nasze
but now
życie?
that we are open to the
Raptem widzimy
outside
tutaj
world, how
migrację
does it
Żydów
influence our
ze
life?
społecznością
So,
europejską.
suddenly we see the
Jeśli
integration
tak,
of
to
Jews
musimy
into
sobie
European
wybrać
society.
kierunek.
And if
Jakim
so, then
kierunku?
we
To
have to
bardzo
choose
wybrać.
a
Każdy na
direction.
swój sposób
And there were
musiał
many
zrozumieć,
different possibilities,
jaką będzie
directions. So
jego
everyone
tożsamość
had to
religijna, jaką
understand
jest jego
what's their
tożsamość
religious
narodowa.
identity, what's their
Więc
national identity.
wielu Żydów zdecydowało się zmniejszyć swoje zaangażowanie w
So many
naukę
Jews chose
żydowską
to
ze
reduce their
względu na
engagement with
egoizm,
Jewish learning, the
filantropię,
observance
czy
of
też
rituals,
edukację
philanthropy,
dzieci w
the
strefie
education of their
nauk
children
religijnych,
when it comes to
powiązanych
religious
z
studies
nauczaniem się języka
related,
hebrajskiego
for
czy tradycji
example, with
żydowskiej,
learning
ponieważ
Hebrew
jeżeli teraz
or
mamy
Jewish
otwartą
traditions.
edukację
Because if now
ogólną,
we have
jeżeli
access
nasze dzieci
to
teraz mogą się nauczyć
general
matematyki,
education,
to dlaczego
our
musimy
children now can
ograniczyć
study math.
dostęp do
So
tego?
why
Nie,
would we
chcemy
limit
być
them access to
edukowanymi,
it? No, we want
więc
to be well
to też
educated.
wybiera nam nowy skutek. To, co zaczynamy
So
nazywać
this also yields
asymilacją,
new
czyli
consequences, something
było
that
prawie
we call
niemożliwe poprzednio, kiedy nie
assimilation,
mieliśmy żadnych praw
something
w
that was almost
średniowiecznej
impossible
społeczności.
before when
Teraz stało
we
się
had almost no rights in a closed medieval
prezentem
community.
i zagrożeniem.
Now has become
Możemy być
a
razem ze
gift and at the
społecznością
same time a
ogólną,
threat.
ale
We
też
can be
zagrożenie
together
to
with the
jest
general
to jest
community, but
zagrożenie
there is
asymilacją,
also a threat
że
related to
ktoś
it, namely the
zdecyduje się
threat of
przestać
assimilation, that
być
someone
Żydem.
may choose to stop being
Na
a
wczesnych
Jew.
etapach Żydzi, którzy dążyli do nowych
In
modyfikacji,
the early
reform
stages,
żydowskiej
those Jews who
praktyk,
sought to modify,
postrzegali swoje
reform Jewish practices
wysiłki jako
did
nie
not
bunt,
view their
a
efforts
tylko
as a
skromną
rebellion,
próbę
but
harmonizacji.
rather as a modest
Czyli
attempt at
tak, jesteśmy
harmonization.
Żydami, ale
So they said, yes, we are Jews, but at the same time, we can benefit from general education and general
Na razie
rights.
jeszcze przypominam nam o tym, o czym
And the first
mówiliśmy
such
poprzednio,
attempts,
że
and
taka
just to
sprawa
remind
miała
you,
miejsce w
the first such attempt took
1798
place
roku w
in
Amsterdamie. Tam właśnie
1796 in
niewielka
Amsterdam.
grupa oddzieliła się od głównej synagogi
A
aszkenazyjskiej
small group separated from
i
the main Ashkenazi
założyło
synagogue
nową
there,
wspólnotę.
and
Później
it
ta wspólnota
established
była
a
znana jako
new
Adat Jeshurun.
congregation, later known as
Co
Adat Yeshurun.
zmieniają? Jakie nowe normy
So,
nam
what
tutaj
did they
wprowadzają?
change? What kind of new
Usunęli
things did they
niektóre drugorzędne
introduce?
części nabożeństwa.
They removed certain
Dlaczego? Ponieważ
secondary
nabożeństwo,
parts of the
które jest
service
zbyt długie,
that were
no
not
to człowiek, który
necessary.
się
And that's
modli,
because
który
if the
nie jest
service is
aż
too
zbyt
long,
dedykowany
then
w
if
całej
someone is
historii
praying
żydowskiej
and
od
they
początku do
are not
końca,
really well
gdyż nie
educated in
można
the
się,
whole Jewish
a co jest z
history
tego
from the
główne, a
beginning to
co
the
jest
end,
drugorzędne,
then
i
they
powiedzieli mu,
cannot really
żyj
know
Bogiem.
what is the main element and
Zwykami
what is
stało się aż
secondary.
tak
So
długo,
they said,
to
okay,
musimy
since
troszeczkę ją
across the
skrócić,
ages the
tak
prayer
aby
became
człowiek też
so
rozumiał,
long,
ok,
then we have to abbreviate it
Szma,
a little bit
Amida,
so
to
that
są
people
główne
will
części.
understand that
Jeżeli
the
jest
Shema, the
aż
Amidah
dużo
are the
poezji
main elements.
dodatkowej,
But
która
if you have so many
dodawała się
additional poems,
na tych wszystkich wiekach, w średniowieczu, to czasami, jeżeli trzeba, to można
all the
skrócić tą
elements that were
poezję.
being added over the
Co
ages,
inne
like poetry
wprowadzili
added in medieval ages, then sometimes we can
kazanie,
shorten it.
które słuchali w ciszy,
They also
jak można było
introduced
im zadawać
a
pytania, a co
sermon
tam
that
jest,
they
jak
listened
tam
to in
jest.
silence without asking
Technicznie,
questions
jako
about
rabinka
it.
powiem, że kazanie z pytaniami, no to zajmuje bardzo dużo
So, well,
czasu.
technically, if you
A
say that
jeżeli już
you
mówimy o
have
czasie
a
dla,
sermon with
kiedy człowiek
questions, then it
pracuje,
takes
kiedy
up a lot of
człowiek
time. And since
nie ma
these are already modern
czasu na
times when
świecie po
people
to,
are
żeby
working, so
tylko
they
siedzieć
do
w
not have that
synagodze,
much free time to
no to
spend
było
all their
to
time in a synagogue,
dla nich niepotrzebne.
then,
Jeszcze
well, this
jedna rzecz,
became
którą
an
zrobili, to
unnecessary
znieśli
thing for them.
sprzedaż wywołań do tory, aliyot,
And they also
aukcje.
abolished the
To było
auctioning of
bardzo
Torah
dla nich
collapse,
teraz
aliyot.
e, naturalne po to, żeby człowiek nie mógł, ten, który ma więcej pieniędzy,
So
mieć więcej
they simply
przedmiotów.
wanted to make sure that they do not
Wtedy,
have
kiedy
additional
mówimy
privileges for the wealthy.
o nowych reformach, to warto wspomnieć, że
And as we talk about
przewodniczącym
new reforms, it's worth
konsystatorza był
mentioning that the
Israel Jakobson,
chairman of the consistory was
znany
Israel
filantropa,
Jacobson.
który właśnie wprowadza nam
He
nowe
was a
zmiany,
well-known
że
philanthropist,
w roku
and he
1810
introduced new changes.
zbudował synagogę na potrzeby
So in
żydowskiej szkoły handlowej.
1810, Jacobson
Ale
built a
było
synagogue
tak,
for the
synagoga
Jewish
bardzo
commercial
wyjątkowo.
school. But this was
Budynek
a unique
został
synagogue.
sprojektowany tak, aby miejsca
The building was designed
przywódców
so that
znajdowały
the
się z
place
przodu
for the
sali, a nie w
leader was
środku, co
located at
już
the front of the
dla
hall
niektórych
rather than in
było
the
aż
middle.
tak wielką zmianą,
And for some,
że
this already
policja
was such a
nie mogła
great
się
change
dostosować.
that
Były
it was
tam również
simply
organy.
something
To
that
chyba
tradition could not
było
adjust to.
najbardziej
They
szokujące
also had
dla
an organ,
społeczeństwa
and this was
żydowskiego
the
tego
most
czasu,
shocking thing for the
ponieważ
Jewish community
organy
in those
to
times.
jest coś, co nie wiąże się w naszym wyobrażeniu z tradycją żydowską.
Because
A
in our
tutaj
imagination,
powiem,
an organ is
że
not
były tam
something
nawet
connected to
dzwonnice.
Jewish tradition. And
Jak myślimy
let
sobie
me
o
add that they
dzwonnicy,
even
to
had a
zapewne
bell tower.
wyobrażamy nie
So
tradycję
if we think
żydowską,
about a
tylko
bell
tradycję
tower, we don't think about the Jewish tradition, but
jaką
rather
w tych czasach?
about what tradition in those
Chrześcijańską.
times? The Christian
Dziękuję bardzo.
tradition.
Tak? Czyli wprowadza nam tutaj zupełnie nowe zmiany, które były w
So
tych
he was
czasach bardzo
introducing
obce
completely
kultowi
new
żydowskiemu.
things, new changes, which at that time were something
Kiedy
foreign to the
konsystor się
Jewish
padł, no to
tradition.
przenosi się do Berlina.
When
W
the consistory
1814
collapsed,
roku
he moved to
Jakobson
Berlin.
miał swoją
Jacobson moved to
własną
Berlin, and in
małą synagogę w swoim
1815
domu
he opened his own
i to
private
przyciąga bardzo
synagogue in
dużo
his own
zwolenników.
home, and
Tak,
he also
skrócone
attracted many
nabożeństwo, kazanie w
followers.
języku niemieckim,
So there was a
języku zrozumiałe
shortened
dla wszystkich.
prayer.
W
The
tych czasach
sermon
już
was
nie
given
każdy
in
Żyd
German, so everyone could
swobodnie mówi w
understand
języku
it. In those
hebrajskim.
times, not all the
Już
Jews
mówią
could
w języku
speak
niemieckim,
Hebrew fluently.
ponieważ mieszkają w Niemczech
They were
i
speaking
mają
German
pełną
because
obywatelstwo.
they were living in Germany and they already had
I
their civic rights.
w międzyczasie te idee też przychodzą do reformatorów w
Meanwhile,
Hamburgu.
the
Do
ideas
miejsca,
of the
które było
Berlin
wówczas
reformers reached Hamburg.
największym wolnym miastem.
In those times, that was
Społeczność
the
żydowska była
largest
największą w
free
Niemczech.
city and
Tam
with the
można
largest Jewish
było
community in
otworzyć
Germany.
nową synagogę
So there it was
bez
possible
ingerencji
to
rządu.
open a new synagogue
Hamburskie
without
świątyni
government
Tempel,
interference.
tak nazwali swoje
So
synagogi.
they called it the
Tempel w
Hamburg
tłumaczeniu to
Temple,
będzie świątynia.
and temple, of
I
course, means
wspomnieliśmy już,
the
że
temple.
same słowo, sama nazwa Tempel to już mówi nam o jakiejś
So as we
konkretnej
said,
pozycji.
that the name
Czyli nie
itself
czekamy, aż
already
odbuduje
tells
się
us
nowa świątynia
something
trzecia.
about
Już
our
mamy
beliefs.
swoje
So we are not
świątynie
waiting for the
tutaj,
rebuilding of the third
w
temple
naszych
because we
czasach,
already have
w
our
naszych
temple
miastach.
here in our
I
towns
w
and cities, in our times.
1818 roku poświęcona była ta
So in
otwarta ta świątynia
1818,
Tempel.
this
I
Hamburg temple
wprowadzono
was
nowe innowacje
dedicated
liturgiczne,
and they introduced new
które
liturgical
wcześniej już
innovations
widzieli, jak
that
starały
had
się
previously been
pilnie
tested in
w innych
Berlin
miastach.
and in other
Wprowadzają
towns.
swój własny modlitewnik
They
Seder
introduced
Havoda,
their own
porządek
prayer book, Seder
modlitwy.
Havoda, the order of
Właśnie
prayer.
teraz, w tym czasie, przechodzimy od eksperymentu
So now in
do
those
ruchu.
times, we are moving from experiment to
Raptem
movement.
widzimy, że judaizm przesuwa się z prawa, z działania
So
w
suddenly we
stronę
see
wiary.
that Judaism is
Teraz
moving
już
from law
każdą
or
rzecz
action
trzeba nie
toward
tylko wiedzieć, że
faith.
trzeba tak robić.
So now
We'aseh nishma.
it's not enough to
Zrobimy już
say
tak.
we have to do
Teraz
something.
trzeba
Ve'aseh v'nishma,
argumentować.
we
Teraz
will
trzeba
listen and
stwarzać
we will do.
nowe dzieła. Dzieła
Right now,
filozoficzne,
you need to write new
dzieła,
works,
które mówią nam nie
philosophical
jedynie o
works
halasę,
that
jak w postępowaniu, a też pomagają ludziom zrozumieć,
we
dlaczego
have
trzeba
these
tak
new
robić.
works that they
Gdzie
also help
jest
people understand
źródło
why
tej czy
something
innej
should be
mitzwy.
done. What is the
A w tym
source of a
samym
given
czasie
mitzvah?
powstaje nauka o judaizmie. Czyli
And
już teraz
in the same time,
chcemy
we have
nie
the
jedynie
science of
znać,
Judaism.
co trzeba robić, a
So we
też
no longer just want to
dowiedzieć
know
się,
what
skąd to
we
wszystko
should do,
pochodzi,
but we also
jak
want
historia
to
się rozwijała.
find out where it
Czyli
comes
od tego
from,
czasu zaczynamy
how it
podchodzić,
changed across
to jest
history.
oświecenie żydowskie, zaczynamy podchodzić do
So this is the
judaizmu
Jewish
z
enlightenment.
punktu historii.
So we
Ale
start
jeżeli
to
znamy też
approach
historię, to
Judaism from the
możemy
viewpoint of history.
zdecydować, jakie
But
rzeczy
if
są
we know history,
pierwszorzędne,
then we
jakie
can
rzeczy są
decide what is
drugorzędne, co jest ważniejsze,
crucial, essential, and
co
what is
można
of
ominąć
secondary
w tych czasach,
importance.
kiedy mamy
So
nowe
what
realia.
can be skipped in our times when
Jednym
we live in a
z
new
najbardziej
reality?
znanych pionierów takich nowych czasów to był
One of
Leopold
the most
Zunz.
famous pioneer of the
Leopold
new
Zunz
times
był,
was Leopold Zunz.
znał się jako kaznodzieja w synagodze
So he
domowej
began as a
w Berlinie
preacher
u
in the
Bera.
home synagogue in
Był
Berlin
bardzo
at Ber's
szanowanym
house,
uczonym. Nauczał, że
but he
nowoczesne,
also
naukowe,
became a
klasyczne
widely respected
badania
scholar.
klasycznych
He
tekstów
thought that
żydowskich
modern
może
scientific
przynieść
and
wiedzę
critical study of the
historyczną,
classical Jewish
która z
texts
kolei może
could yield
dostarczyć
historical
nam
knowledge,
wskazówek
which in turn could provide
do obecnego
guidance for
życia
the contemporary
Żydów.
lives of Jews.
Czyli na przykład, jeśli ktoś chciałby poddać rewizji modlitewnik,
So,
o
for
czym już
example, if
wspomnieliśmy,
someone wished
co
to
jest
revise the
ważniejsze, co
prayer
jest
book, as we already mentioned,
drugorzędne, kiedy
decide
to
what
wszystkie
is
się
essential, what is secondary,
doszło do tego modlitewnika, to wtedy badania
when were
historii
various elements
liturgii
added to the prayer book,
mogłyby
then
pomóc wyjaśniać
studying
trudne
the
do
history
zrozumienia
of the
modlitwy.
liturgy could help explain
Mogłoby
prayers that
udowodnić,
were
że
difficult to understand.
modlitewnik ma historię.
It could
To, o
help
czym nawet
demonstrate
we
that the prayer
współczesnych
book
czasach,
itself
w
has a
XXI
history.
wieku, nie mówi się.
And this is
Czyli
something that it's
każda
not
modlitwa
often talked
powstała w
about even
jakimś
now in the
czasie.
21st century,
Każda
that
modlitwa
each prayer was
miała swoją
created at a
historię.
given time. Each prayer has its own
I
history.
wtedy też mógł z tego punktu widzenia zaproponować alternatywne teksty,
So, from that
oparte
viewpoint, they could
na
also
stwierdzonych
suggest
czasem
alternative
materiałach i
texts
sformułowaniach i
based
odpowiedziach.
on some
Tak
earlier
jak na przykład
formulations,
dzisiaj,
on
kiedy mamy
earlier answers.
do przykładu
For example, today, when, for example, we have a difficult situation in Israel, then we know that in the reform movement, there will appear a prayer that will respond to the current situation. If someone is sitting in a bomb shelter, then they need a prayer that will match what's happening, and it will become part of their life. So if we go back to history, we look at what happened in those times, then in the decades that followed the dedication of the Hamburg Temple, the initial emphasis on modernizing the aesthetics of the synagogue shifted more toward more substantial questions. Questions such as whether preserve core practices like circumcision, so something that before went without questions, was a given, now was the subject of questions. Should we observe Shabbat and in what way? So suddenly we start asking questions. The ideas and practices of the reformers found a sympathetic reception in many communities. They were liked by many Jews who became parts of the general community. So local experiments of this kind multiplied because by 1869, at least 60 congregations in Germany identified themselves with Reform Judaism. The growth in numbers, generational change, because we have various generations. If someone was born in, let's say, 1770 something, has different beliefs, positions compared to someone who was born, let's say, 60 years later, because, well, they live in a different reality. And this awareness was expressed in three rabbinical conferences, 1844, 1845, 1846. Each was attended by several dozen rabbis who identified with the reform direction, with a more modern Judaism. So we actually do not use the word reform yet because such a movement was not yet established, but they already had an idea about how we should survive this new reality, this new era. So, what conclusions did they derive? It was agreed that the decisions of the rabbis would carry moral authority, but would not be binding. If you'd like me to give you an example, so if someone asks me as a rabbi whether I can drive to Shabbat in my car, then the only thing I can reply is, this is your decision.
Przyjęto w tych czasach wiele, powiedzmy, pionierskich rezolucji.
So in those times, many pioneering resolutions were adopted. The rabbis expressed their definition of Judaism as a religion rather than a nationality, something that, well, did not hold, because even today, for Reform Judaism, religion and nationality is something that is interconnected. There is no clear division between it. So at the beginning of their history, they would rescind, drop prayers about the return to the land of Israel, because they said, we are Jews based on our religion. So if we live in Germany, that means we are Germans. This will change with times in the 20th century. Reform will say, no, we are Zionists. Reform Judaism is Zionist Judaism, which wants for a Jewish state to exist, which wants for the Hebrew language to exist, and so on. So here it's also worth emphasizing that not all the changes introduced by Reform Judaism stayed over time. A lot of things have changed over 200 years. And they decided to preserve key prayers in Hebrew, but they also started to use the local language during services. So in Germany, that would be the German language. So suddenly you open your prayer book and you have a German translation. So you can read the blessing before reading the Shema in German. And this is something that we have up until this day, because in each congregation, we can open our prayer book and you'll have two versions, so one in Hebrew and one in the local language. And what's interesting, they sanction the use of organs to enhance or beautify Shabbat services. We already said that organs are mostly associated with Christianity, but still in Germany, you have a couple of synagogues with organs, in the United States as well. Well, they are kind of doing away with them, but still you have some of them. So if you are ever in Berlin, you should visit one of the synagogues that still functions as a traditional Reform synagogue. It has organs. They are not being used too frequently, and it also has a choir. And there is a division between men and women. So this is a classical reform. So the reform that they were introducing are not the same as the reforms we have today. So what else did they do? They relaxed the prohibition on travel on Shabbat. So I was already alluding to that, that you do not have clear-cut rules. It's your decision. They also shortened the observance of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Let me explain. So originally in the Jewish calendar, if we read the Mishnah, if someone wanted to decide what day or what month in the Jewish calendar it is, then historically you would do it based on witnesses. So you had the testimony of a witness. So someone who was in Eretz Israel and they saw that you have a new moon. Then they had to go to the Beit Din and say, hey, I saw a new moon. And then the Beit Din would say, okay, the new month has started. But with time, the calendar became more based on mathematics. So we are no longer waiting for a witness to show up and tell us they saw the new moon, because it all can be calculated. But traditionally, this was so complicated that we were never sure if the new moon actually already appeared or not. And that's why, when it comes to the most important, some of the most important festivals, we decided to observe them for 2 days rather than one. For example, like Rosh Hashanah in some Orthodox congregations is observed for 2 days, or the same for Passover. And why? Because in the times of Mishnah, almost 2,000 years ago, they couldn't set the date correctly, precisely. So just in case, they decided to observe them for 2 days rather than one. But Reform Judaism came about and they said, why should we observe for 2 days? Now we have a precise calendar, so one day will be enough. And that's how it is today, that Reform Judaism observes the festivals according to the Jewish calendar, but it doesn't add the additional day. And now a very interesting person we must remember about this person, Rabbi Abraham Geiger, a German rabbi and scholar. And he was the one who is believed to be one of the founding fathers of Reform Judaism. He lived in the 19th century and he made a significant contribution to shaping the Reform movement, whose character is also present and seen today. Geiger sought a more coherent ideological foundation that would justify the introduction of innovations in liturgy and religious practice. He would try to justify them, telling that it's a kind of a continuation of Jewish tradition. Geiger argued that Reform Judaism was not a rejection of earlier Judaism, but it was actually the restoration of the Pharisaic halakhic tradition. So, why is he talking about the Pharisees? It's because the Mishnah, which was kind of trying to copy the Pharisees, so it tells us that they themselves would create a new world after the destruction of the temple. So the temple was destroyed in the year 70 of Common Era, and then Jewish tradition had to be reformed. So it already was a large reform. Suddenly prayers appeared that replaced sacrifices, offerings, because you no longer have a temple. So the tradition, the Pharisaic tradition, would replace the offerings with prayers. So Geiger tells us that Reform Judaism was not a rejection of earlier Judaism, but it was a restoration of the Pharisaic halakhic tradition, which is nothing other than the principle of continuous further development in accordance with the spirit of the times.
Czas idzie i tradycja judaizmu jest w tym, że judaizm cały
So
czas
time goes
się
by,
zmienia.
and the tradition of Judaism is such that Judaism keeps on changing. And he reminded us that the word halacha, Jewish law, what is the core, lalechet, to go, to walk, that's the root. So Jewish law keeps on changing depending on the current times. So as for Geiger, let me say a few words about Abraham Geiger. We don't talk about him enough, considering he's a very famous figure. So Geiger was born in Frankfurt, and the family of Geiger did not escape the conflict that we are talking about. It was a conflict of those times between generations, between the old and the new times. For example, his brother Solomon, who was 18 years older than him, for his whole life decided to stay closer to the traditional Jewish movement, what today we call Orthodoxy. But nonetheless, he was always supporting his younger brother, always supporting his strivings. The father of Abraham Geiger died when Abraham was still little, so his brother Solomon took care of his education. He received the classical Jewish education. He was studying the Torah and the Mishnah. And as I said, Abraham was 18 years younger than Solomon, so we can imagine he was kind of a father figure for him. As for Abraham's mother, then even though he was already part of the German community, when he wrote letters to her, he would always use Hebrew characters. So she was more rooted in tradition. He did not receive a systematic modern education, at least in his early years. So he would not study math. But he was a true wonder kid. So at the age of 3, he was taught to read the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. When he was 4 years old, the Mishnah. I actually can't imagine that, to be honest, to study the Mishnah when you're 4 years old. When he was 6 years old, he started to study the Talmud. The acquisition of secular knowledge was left largely to chance. Or actually, he always had a great passion for learning. He always wanted to learn more and more. So he was always reading something. So any book that was available to him, he would study it. Mathematics was for him a world of wonders. He also wanted to learn and study the German language and classical literature. He was also interested in classical authors. So let's emphasize that he received the traditional Jewish education, but in addition, many things enriched his education. He managed to persuade his family, though not without difficulty, to allow him to study at a university. This was a step that traditional Jews of that time regarded as a dangerous experiment. Because if you start learning something else, then you may decide to leave your tradition, your former lifestyle. But nonetheless, they allowed him to do that. Geiger was only 19 years old when he moved to Heidelberg. But the academic program offered there at the university, well, did not particularly impress him. He was studying philosophy and Oriental languages, but well, it was just simply not appropriate for him. It was not what he wanted. He said the level was actually quite low. So after a short summer semester, Geiger left the Heidelberg University and he moved to Bonn. And let's emphasize that at that time, university studies were by no means common, especially for Jews. So in Bonn, Geiger met a couple of young people, also Jews, who in subsequent years would become his friends. Among others, one of them was Rabbi Samuel Raphael Hirsch. We'll talk about him later. Geiger's interests were not limited to Oriental languages. He was also drawn to philosophy, classical philology, as well as to astronomy and zoology. As we said, he was a wunderkind, so he wanted to learn as much as possible. One of Geiger's professors of Oriental studies, he allowed him to join a competition to write a prize essay. And Geiger wrote the prize essay on the topic, "What did Mohammed take from Judaism?" So that means that he was learned not only in Judaism, but also in other religions. So Geiger's dissertation, submitted in Latin, was awarded the prize and was published in 1838. So on the one hand, this marked the completion of his university studies, and at the same time, it was the first work that presented him as a serious scholarly researcher, a member of the academia.
wie bardzo dużo o tym, jakie wykształcenie otrzymał, ale też w
So I talk
międzyczasie
a lot
mówił
about
o relacjach
what kind of
miłosnych,
education
które
he got,
zazwyczaj
but let's
musi
also
udać
talk
kobiety,
about
że
his
tata
love
się
interest.
posunił w ojcu
That's also very interesting. And
ruchu
we must always remember
reformowanego
that
i
all the
ludzi.
scholars, all the
Więc
founding
w tym
fathers of the
czasie mieli
reform
szkoły
movement were also
siostrzeńskie.
human. So
Wtedy
during
też
this time, he
widział
also
się
began to think
głęboką
about
miłością
marriage
do
as he
Emilii
had
Oppenheim,
developed a deep love
córki
for Emily
bogatego kupca
Oppenheim,
z
the
Bonn.
daughter of a wealthy
Jednak
merchant
musiała
from
minąć
Bonn.
jeszcze 7 lat, zanim
However,
mógł
7 more years
uczynić
had to
ją swoją
pass before he
narzeczoną.
was able to
Myślę,
make
że
her
też to nam
his
przypomina
fiancée.
historię
I
wszystkich
think this
pustyń
reminds
w
us of some
międzyczasie.
stories from the five
Ale
books of Moses.
taka też była jego historia. Stała
But
się
that
Emilia
was
jego
Geiger's
żoną, mieli
history.
też dzieci.
Emilia
Bardzo
became his
znana.
wife. They also had
Opuścił
children.
Bonn
It's
bez
well
uzyskania
known.
stopnia
So
akademickiego,
he left Bonn without obtaining
ale
an academic
wciąż o
degree,
tym marzył, jak też o
but he still
ordynacji
dreamt about
rabbinickiej,
that,
więc
as well as
oba te
about
tytuły
rabbinical
uzyskał
ordination.
później
So he got both of these
bez wielkich
degrees
trudności
later without
w
much
Marburgu,
difficulty. It
gdzie jego
happened in Marburg.
pracę konkursową, którą już powiedzieliśmy o Muhammedzie, uznali jako
So
dostateczną po to,
they
żeby mu
considered
przyznać
his
tytuł
prize-winning
akademicki.
essay
I
about
też
Mohammed
w tym
sufficient
samym
to
czasie
grant him a doctoral
dostał
dissertation.
tytuł
And
rabiniczny
at the same time, he
przez
also received his
wielkiego
rabbinical
rabbi
ordination
Gossena
from an
z
important
Marburgu.
rabbi Gossen in Marburg.
Jeżeli mówimy o Geigerze, wprowadzał bardzo dużo nowych zmian. Jak to
Geiger
bardzo
introduced
często w
many
czasopismach
changes. And how
pracował w
did he do
juryach
it? Very
różnych,
often in
ale
journals, he worked in
zapoczątkował
various communities,
czasopismo,
but he
które
launched
nazywano
a
naukowe czasopismo
journal.
teologii
It was
żydowskiej.
called the Scientific Journal of
Mógł
Jewish
znaleźć
Theology.
zwolenników, którzy podtrzymali jego idei i
So
mógł znaleźć
that's how he
finansowanie
could
na
find
wydanie tego czasopisma, co
people
też
who
świadczy o tym,
agreed
na
with his
ile był
ideas, and he
człowiekiem
also
praktycznym,
managed to
wykształconym.
find financing
I
for this
czasopismo
project.
to
So this
zostało
shows
założone w
also
roku
what kind of person he was. So the
1838.
journal was founded in
E,
1835,
Bardzo dużo swoich nowych zmian też tłumaczył, dlaczego tak jest. Jeżeli
and
mówił
he
o tym,
also
że wprowadzamy język niemiecki,
explained
to też dawał
why
swoje
he's
wytłumaczenie,
proposing so many
dlaczego
changes. If he
to jest
proposed
aktualne.
to
Jeżeli
use
mówił o tym,
German, the
że
local language, he
skracamy
would explain
modlitwy, to
why. If
wyjaśniał
he
dlaczego i wszystko to robił
promoted
w swoich
abbreviating prayers, he
czasopismach.
would also explain why, and
E,
he would write about it in
W
his
roku
journals.
1838 zarząd gminy we Wrocławiu
So in
czasem
1838, the
Breslau
leadership of the Jewish community
ogłosił,
in
że
Wrocław, back
poszukuje
then it was Breslau,
uczonego w dziedzinie
announced that it
teologii,
was
który
seeking a
potrafiłby
scholar of
połączyć
theology who
wszechstronną,
could
dobitną
combine
talmudyczną
comprehensive
edukację
biblical and
ze
Talmudic
świeckim rytuałem.
education with a good
Czyli
secular
e,
education.
widzimy, że raptem ma możliwość, tak, żeby
So
przeglądać
suddenly
swoje
some
talmudy.
opportunities
I
became
wtedy,
available to
tak,
put his
Geiger
talents on
został
display.
zaproszony e, do tej synagogi we Wrocławiu w
So Geiger was invited to the
1838 roku.
synagogue in Wrocław in
Stało się to też
1838,
pomimo protestów
and this
ówczesnego
took
rabina
place despite the
Efimkiego
protests of the
Tiktine.
person who was the rabbi
Lokalne
in those
władze
places back then, Tiktin.
państwowe musiały też zatwierdzić
The
takie
local
zaproszenie ze
state
strony
authorities
synagogi.
also had to approve
I
such an
bardzo znany był
invitation from the
Tiktin,
synagogue.
który był bardziej tradycyjnych poglądów.
So
Był
even
przeciwko
though Tiktin,
pojawieniu się
who
Geigera
was more
we
traditional,
Wrocławiu,
was against
lokalne władze
Geiger
go
coming to
odrzuciły.
Wrocław, nonetheless, the local authorities
Mimo krzyczanego
rejected
protestu.
Tiktin's protests.
Więc Tiktin
They said they
zgłosił
were
do
unfounded.
ministerstwa w Berlinie,
So Tiktin
które
therefore appealed to the
wydawało
ministry in
nieprzekazujące
Berlin, which
podejmowania
issued a decree
nowych, różnych
forbidding the
działań.
community to undertake any new
Geiger
activities, any innovations.
zrobił tak, że gmina jego bardzo polubiła. Jeszcze
But
do
the community
wprowadzenia
really liked Geiger.
tego dekretu, czy jeszcze do wprowadzenia wszystkich tych nagłych przeciwko niego agresji wygłosił kazanie w języku
So
niemieckim, ubrany
he
w
actually
jakieś
gave a sermon
szaty
in
specjalne, które
German,
bardziej przypominały szaty kogoś z
and he was
chrześcijaństwa
also dressed in
protestantyzmu,
official
czyli
clerical
inne szaty.
attire, which resembled
Generalnie
someone
ubrał
coming
się
from
w inne
Christianity or from
ubieranie.
the Protestant
I
movement. Well, that was not how
właśnie
traditional
kongregacja
rabbis
polubiła
would
go aż tak, że
be
zdecydowali
dressed.
się
But the community liked him
wybrać jego na
so
swojego
much
rabina,
that they
nie
decided
patrząc na
to
to,
choose him
że
for their rabbi.
właśnie tego ówczesny rabin tych ziemi był na tyle przeciwko
They
niego, że
didn't
napisał
mind
różne
that
groźby
the rabbi in
do
that place, Tikhtin,
Berlinu
really
i
didn't like
Srebrenniego
Geiger,
i
so he was
zatykaczy,
writing to
nie
Berlin
robi problemów
to
dla
oppose him.
ówczesnej
So the authorities in Berlin were
władzy w
checking
Niemczech
whether
i
Geiger is not some kind of a
ostatecznie musieli
radical, if
wszyscy
he wouldn't
przyznać,
cause any political
że
trouble, and
nie
so on.
znaleziono w nim
So they had an
najmniejszych
investigation, and they all
śladów
had to agree that
politycznego
they couldn't find
radykalizmu,
any signs of
więc
political
został rabinem
radicalism when it comes to
we
Geiger.
Wrocławiu.
So he did become the rabbi in Wrocław or Breslau.
1846 musimy powiedzieć, że we Wrocławiu po długich debatach,
So
6-letnich
in
debatach,
1846 in
oficjalnie
Wrocław,
uznaje się
after
dwie kongregacje.
6 years after long debates,
Reformowana i
two
ortodoksyjna.
congregations were officially recognized, the Reform
Teraz
one and
musimy
the
sobie
Orthodox one.
wytłumaczyć, jakie odpowiedzi byli na powstanie judaizmu
So
reformowanego.
now let's talk about the responses to
Gdy
the
ówczesne
establishment of Reform
eksperymenty
Judaism.
związane z reformą tradycyjnego kultu
As the
przekształcili się
early
w ruch,
experiments aimed at reforming traditional worship
który
developed into a
jasno odrzucał
movement,
autorytet i znaczenie halachy, pojawiła
and
się
this movement
szybko
clearly rejected the authority and significance of
konkurujące
halacha,
alternatywy
several responses emerged proposing
reformowania,
alternative
które
approaches
następnie
to the reform
przekształciły się w
movement,
nowe ruchy.
which in turn
Więc
developed
każdy
into
raz,
new
gdy się to
movements.
słyszy współczesnych czasach,
So
ktoś
each
mówi,
time when
nie jestem
nowadays I
ortodoksem,
hear
ale szanuję
when someone
ortodoksów,
says, I am
ponieważ
not an
zachowali
Orthodox, but I
judaizm,
respect
to
the
muszę
Orthodox
teraz
because
w tej
they
chwili
kept
powiedzieć
Judaism,
Wam
then
wszystkim.
I always feel
Ortodoksja
the urge to
pojawia
say
się jako
that
reakcja,
Orthodoxy
odpowiedź
appeared
na
as
judaizm
a
reformowany,
response, as a reaction
czyli
to Reform Judaism.
po judaizmie reformowanym.
So it
Dlaczego?
appeared after Reform
Ortodoksja,
Judaism.
ten termin w odniesieniu do
Why?
tradycyjnego judaizmu po raz pierwszy użyto w
Orthodoxy, the
roku
term itself, was first applied to
1800,
traditional Judaism around the
jest
year
przykładem
1800,
całkowitego odrzucenia przez sąd rabiniczny w
exemplified
Hamburgu wszelkich
by the
innowacji,
complete rejection by
nawet
the
tych
rabbinical court
najbardziej
in Hamburg
trywialnych.
of any innovations,
Bardzo
even the most
często
trivial
ortodoksja kojarzy
ones.
się z imieniem rabina Moshe
So
Sofera.
very often, orthodoxy is
Hatam
connected
Stam,
to the name of
przykład
Rabbi
ostatni
Moshe
w odniesieniu
Sofer.
do jego dzieła, jego książki. Co on mówi? Mówi,
So
Hadash
what
Asur
did he
Milchastor.
say?
Nowe jest wzbronione z Tory.
What's new
Teraz wyobrażamy
is
sobie
prohibited by the
linię
halacha.
czasową historii żydowskiej.
Now let's think about the
Nowe
timeline of Jewish
i
history.
przekształcenia były w naszym narodzie
So new
zawsze,
things,
od
adjustments,
wieków.
changes were
Czyli
always
kiedy mówi
present in our
Hadash Asurim
nation
Hatora, nowe
for
jest
many,
wzbronione
many
Torą,
centuries. So when he says
odwołuje
that
się
what's new
głównie
is
do
prohibited by
innych
the Torah, he is
rzeczy, o których
actually
mówi tradycja
referring to
żydowska.
something else
Zupełnie
mentioned by the
nieobecne,
Jewish
żadna
tradition.
innowacja czy modernizacja jest obca
This did
judaizmowi,
not
ponieważ
mean that
już
Judaism
mieliśmy wymiar Geiger,
is
proszę
something where
Państwa,
you don't have
Faryzeów
any
przywódców
innovations or
Nataru. To
changes.
wszystko
As
jest
Geiger already
nowe w
mentions,
tradycji
the
żydowskiej.
Pharisees,
Tego
the Mishnah, the
wszystkiego
Talmud,
nie
this is all new
istniało
in the Jewish tradition.
do
All of this
zburzenia
did
świątyni.
not
Czyli
exist
judaizm
before the
w swojej
destruction of the
naturze
temple.
jest
So
reformowany
Judaism, of its
już
very
w tym, że
nature,
mamy
is
modlitewnik, którego
reformed,
Mojżesz nie miał.
even because we have a prayer book that
Ale
Moses did not have.
Hatam Sofer
But
Moshe
in Ahatam Sofer,
Sofer,
that was
rabin, mówi nam,
the
wszystko nowe jest
book
wzbronione.
written by Rabbi
I
Moshe
w świetle
Sofer, he said,
tego
everything
widzimy
new is
ludzi
prohibited.
w XXI wieku, którzy
So, as a result of that, we see people in the 20th century, people who are wearing the clothes of Polish nobility from the 16th century. This was just regular clothing of that time, and they adopted it because at a certain moment they said, we are now frozen in time. Nothing new is allowed. We will remain the same as we are right now at this moment. So, if right now we are wearing such hats, if we are wearing this kind of clothes, then starting from now, anything that's new is prohibited. So, that's how we must dress.
Były też inne odpowiedzi, na przykład
There were also
ortodoksja.
other reactions,
Kierunek,
for
który
example,
był
neo-orthodoxy.
popularyzowany
So,
przez
a
wielu
tendency
rabinów,
that was quietly practiced by
dopuszczających
many
różne
traditional rabbis
modyfikacje,
who
kompromisy, ale
permitted
którzy
various
przejść
modifications
bardziej
and
jako korzystne
compromises
dla swoich społeczności
that they considered beneficial for their
bardziej
communities,
klasyczne interpretowanie, e, nie przypisywali
but at the same time, they were not
ideologicznego znaczenia
attributing
swoim
these
innowacjom.
changes, these modifications
Powiem
to
tutaj
any
kilka
ideology.
słów
They
o
would
tym,
not
że
attribute to them any
na
ideological
przykład
significance.
rabin Samson Raphael
So,
Hirsch,
for example, Rabbi Samson
z
Raphael
którym już
Hirsch,
powiedzieliśmy, Geiger zapoznał się
we
w
already
pierwszym
said
gronie,
that
on nauczał
Geiger met him
czegoś
in
ciekawego.
Bonn. So he
On
was
mówił
teaching something interesting.
Torah im derech eretz,
He
czyli
said,
Tora
Torah im derech eretz.
powiązana, w pełni
So Torah
połączona
combined,
ze świecką nauką.
fully connected with
On
secular
był z tych,
learning.
którzy mówili, że halacha i Tora
So
są
he
obowiązujące, ale
believed that the
jednocześnie
halacha
można
and the
się
Torah
nauczać
are still
świeckich
valid, but at the same time,
nauk,
you can study
bez
lay
rezygnacji
subjects,
zachodniego
secular
ubioru,
subjects,
estetyki, żeby
without
czuć,
abandoning Western
możemy
dress,
nadal być
aesthetics, and
Żydami,
culture. We can
czyli
nonetheless still
coś
remain Jews.
bardzo pośrodku.
So this was like the
Też
middle road.
była jeszcze jedna tendencja odpowiedzi,
There
trzecia,
was
jest
also
judaizm
another response,
pozytywno-historyczny.
namely positive
Na
historical
konferencji
Judaism.
rabinicznej we Frankfurcie w
At the rabbinical conference in Frankfurt in
1845 roku,
1845,
gdzie było
it
mówione
was
o tym, że
voted
język
that
hebrajski
the
na
Hebrew
przykład
language was
jest
not
niekoniecznie
necessarily essential
kluczowy
for Jewish
dla
worship.
kultury żydowskiej, dla kultu. Rabin Zachariasz Frankel, z którym teraz się zapoznamy, który był też szefem żydowskiego seminarium teologicznego we Wrocławiu, wyszedł i
Rabbi
argumentował,
Zachariah
chociaż te
Frankel,
szwy
head of the
są
Jewish Theological
wzmacniane,
Seminary in
ale
Wrocław,
nie
he said
można naruszyć pewnych
that although
prawidłowości
change was necessary,
związków
certain
historycznych,
fundamental historical
że jesteśmy
attachments could not
historycznie
be
przywiązani do tego
violated,
języka, do tej ziemi
that we are
i nie możemy tego
historically
naruszyć.
attached to this language, to this land,
I
so we cannot
właśnie on
violate
stał
that.
się prekursorem tego judaizmu
And he is widely
pozytywno-historycznego,
regarded as
który
the
później
precursor of
stał się nam znany jako judaizm
this positive
konserwatywny.
historical Judaism that
Między
later became
reformowanym
known as conservative
kalwinizmem,
Judaism, which is
gdzie
something between
szczególnie
Reform
jest
and
też taki
Orthodox
żart, który
Judaism.
mówi, że czym jest judaizm
There is this joke
konserwatywny?
that says,
To
what
jak
is conservative
judaizm
Judaism?
reformowany, tylko z
It's like
różnicą
Reform
30 lat,
Judaism, but with
ponieważ
a
wszystko
difference of
następuje
30
troszeczkę
years,
później,
because everything happens a
czyli
bit
judaizm
later.
reformowany już w XX wieku
So,
pozwolił
if Reform Judaism
kobiety,
already in the
kobieta
20th
stała się rabinką,
century
no to
allowed
dochodzi do
women
takiej
to become
mniejszej
rabbis,
infleksji
then uh,
judaizmu konserwatywnego.
conservative
W
Judaism still
przyszłość
needed a couple of
możemy
decades
podkreślą,
to
że
introduce
nawet w
the same
judaizmie
change.
ortodoksyjnym w dniu
And
dzisiejszym
some also
kobiety mogą
emphasize that
stać się
today,
rabinkami,
in
co też
some
zajęło bardzo dużo
movements in
czasu,
Orthodox
ale
Judaism,
już
women can become
istnieje u
rabbis.
nas w
It
czasach.
took a long time, but it exists
Powiem
in our
krótko o
times.
tym, o czym będziemy mówić też na naszych kolejnych spotkaniach.
And just briefly
Jeszcze
about
jedną znaną
the
osobą
topics of
będzie
our next
rabin
meetings.
Isaac
Another
Meyer
famous
Weiss,
person is Rabbi
który
Isaac
przenosi
Meyer
się w roku
Weiss. In 1846, he immigrated to the United States, and along with him, the idea of new Judaism, Reform Judaism, moved to the United States along with him. And in 1848, after the failure of the democratic revolutions in Central Europe, this led to a wave of Jewish migration to North America. So many, many Jews would move to the United States in those times. In 1875, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Weiss founded Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. I am a graduate of Hebrew Union College. It was a rabbinical school that originated so long ago, over 150 years ago in the United States. And today it has a couple of campuses in the United States, also one in Jerusalem, which is training Reform rabbis in Israel. And one more date. So in Europe, we have the new movement, the new innovations which are developing in many different places. For example, in Hungary, you have a new movement, neologs. And here you see a person you may recognize. Do you know who that is?
Teofil Herz.
Herz.
No, Theodor Herz.
Theodor Herz.
Do czego tutaj, do nurtu neologów Theodor Herz?
So what's the connection between the neolog movement and Theodor Herz? If we open any encyclopedia that tells us about Theodor Herz, then we read that he was a secular person, non-religious, he came from a secular family. But that's actually not true. Theodor Herzl was born in a family of the neologs in Hungary. So we know, for example, that one of the ceremonies introduced by Reform Judaism was confirmation. So not just bar mitzvah, which says that when a boy is 13 years old, they have to observe the mitzvot. But they said that if we have someone a bit older, when they're 16, 17, or 18 years old, they should also participate in a ceremony of confirmation. That's what Reform Judaism said. So, as to confirm that they are ready to accept Judaism, that now they are already reasonable, it can be their own choice. So his family wanted to have such a ceremony, but because they belonged to the Neolog synagogue, on the one hand, it was close to the Reform movement, but it was even closer to the conservative movement. So that synagogue would not allow such a ceremony, so his family organized that ceremony in their own home. And we know that Theodor Herzl actually belonged to one of the movements of Judaism. But history decided to close their eyes and just say that this movement or such tendencies never existed. So that actually existed. You should not be blind to history, not close your eyes to history. So we see that starting from those times, you have many various new ideas. For example, that the autonomous individual is the ultimate authority when it comes to personal moral behavior and the acceptance of religious rituals as a way of grounding it. So every person must make a decision. And it's still like that today in Reform Judaism. It also says that Jewish texts and tradition can offer guidance, but each individual is sovereign. So you have moral guidance, love your neighbor, but then everyone has to make their own choices. and Jewish and universal values overlap in many areas. So Jews can fully participate both in Judaism and both as members of the broader culture and community, something that we also feel today. We are benefiting and participating in the outside culture, education, studies, but at the same time, we can remain Jews. And according to Reform Judaism, the Torah was not written by God, but inspired by God. And throughout the generations, Judaism has changed in response to new circumstances. And according to Reform Judaism in Germany, back then, there is a new turning point in Jewish history. That was a turning point that gave us flourishing and which also requires us to think, to analyze. And I'd like to conclude with a quote from Rabbi Jacob Petuchowski. So he says, to be able to make an individual choice about which mitzvot to observe, a Reformed Jew must have access to knowledge of the material from which this choice is to be made, knowledge of the mitzvot transmitted by tradition. This, in turn, requires an intensive study of that tradition. In theory, Reformed Jewish education would therefore have to be far more intensive than Orthodox education. So, in order to make a decision, in order to make your own choice regarding which mitzvot are the most important to me, what am I going to decide about my life, about every step along the way, I actually have to have widespread knowledge to be able to choose. So I believe that that's how Judaism actually is, because it's much more difficult to decide than to do what we are told to do. Because in order to decide, you need to have knowledge. And let me conclude with that. So we talked about the Reform Judaism, the new reforms of Judaism in Germany, and then we'll move to North America. Thank you for your attention. And now